When I moved to Baltimore last year, I went to my first NFL game in years. Growing up, I never got the hype of football, but when I saw players like Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry on the field, something clicked. I understood the athleticism, the culture, the fan camaraderie. I finally saw the appeal. But as my eyes were locked on the players on the field, someone else came into the stands and sat a few seats away from me. A white man, draped in an American flag cape, wearing a mask of Donald Trump. And no matter how much I wanted to focus on the game and the athletes, I couldn't stop seeing his flag, hearing his taunts, his disruptions. In that moment, I remembered why I never got into football in the first place. Colin Kaepernick. When he stood up for black lives and lost his jobs, conversations were generated around the racial undertones of football. So in that moment, I realized watching the game as a black woman felt different. I felt the atmosphere of the stadium shift as I realized white men were cheering as black men collided their bodies into one another, pushing their way down the field, fighting to win. Each time I watched a game, I felt drawn in and pushed away at the same time. This was a space where black men could be at the top of their field, dominating the sport. But at the same time, it calls for a sacrifice of their body and minds, and football has a culture that is directly connected to white supremacy and patriarchy. I see it in the white ownership, the fight for recognition of black quarterbacks, advertisements that scream Americanism, sexualize women, and call viewers to buy into everything they see, whether drinks, gambling, or fantasy. These are thoughts I've grappled with as the new NFL season has begun, and with the current political climate, it is hard to ignore these undertones. Then I watched the movie Him, and I felt like my observations and feelings were affirmed. I went to the theaters expecting a horror movie that scratched the surface of sacrifice associated with sports, but it's more than sports horror. I think Him is mythology, folklore, and horror wrapped into one. And why is that important? Mythology is a reflection of our individual and cultural psyche through a supernatural lens. I believe Him is the perfect depiction of a hero's journey, the universal template for personal growth and self-discovery in mythology. We see Cameron Cade begin this journey in his world with his family, with his girlfriend, with his dreams of becoming a great football player. Then we see his call to the new world when he's injured and he has to find a new way to his dream and he's ready to sacrifice to get there. We see him depart and enter this new space, learn from his mentor, learn from those around him, and learn about this world and his world in a new lens. And then finally we see the end where he makes the decision to follow his own path, and that seals his fate. And we don't see his return to his world quite yet, but we do see the summation of his journey in what he decides to do at the end. I think Cameron Cade isn't just on a journey to earn his place among football greats. I believe his story is a depiction of the journey young men take towards manhood, specifically black men as they navigate teachings of masculinity and decide what they value and embody as a man. Football is the perfect depiction of this. What I love about him is the battle between old and new ideology and what you must sacrifice to reach the top. And I think that's a conversation a lot of people are having now as we look for a way out of patriarchy that eliminates toxic masculinity and allows boys to grow into men who are healthy and empowered. These are my thoughts after watching Him as a black woman. Welcome to my channel, Journeying Gracefully. As I said in my introduction, we're going to chat about the movie Him and some themes related to manhood and masculinity. I do want to start by saying I think the underlying theme of this movie, the concept of sacrificing and putting your body on the line to achieve greatness, and how that's been kind of ingrained in our minds from a young age in this country, I think that's a theme that can apply broadly to many demographics, and I think it's something that people should very much reflect on, this exhaustion economy where we are called to, put ourselves on the line to achieve greatness, and even those definitions of greatness have been skewed by historical practices and stigmas and stereotypes. So I want to get that statement out the way. Focusing on this topic that I'm going to talk about does not erase how much this can apply other ways. But for me, watching the movie Him, I think it was very eye-opening to me for the experiences of boys who are becoming men. And I say that as someone who grew up with a black father, grew up with a black brother, I've dated black men. I've just never been to a point where I understand why some men act the way they act in this country. Like it is like mind-boggling. And I think him, as art does, as movies do, allowed me to understand something that I've struggled with understanding, and like see all this from a new perspective. And that's why I want to have this conversation. I do also want to say I'm a woman. Obviously, I don't have too much to say about the experiences of men, black men, whatever. I can only speak to what I'm observing, but I think this is a conversation, a discussion that could be healthy and could benefit our communities. And I think this movie does a perfect job of setting these discussions up. I want to say that me, as someone who has grown up with very much feminist ideologies, womanist ideologies, I grew up very much aligned with social action as it aligns to Black communities and as it aligns to the needs of Black women. I think I've grown up from a lens where it's been easy for me to pinpoint where a lot of men go wrong. It's easy for me to see what's wrong with patriarchy, what's wrong with white supremacy, what's wrong with toxic masculinity, and what that looks like in our communities. But it has been harder for me to understand the way out of that, because for me, it's like, just snap out of it, just change, like what's going on. But this movie, and like things I've picked up on as I've grown as a young adult, is like there's so many factors that go into shaping what Black men are hearing about what makes a man a true man. And a lot of times I have been able to point out what's wrong, but it's not like I'm someone contributing to a clear path forward that allows men to be empathetic, emotional, vulnerable, collaborative, without like the stoicism and the violence, in a way that preserves their masculinity, doesn't tear down their self-esteem, and does not like emasculate them. It's hard to do that. And I think a lot of the times people know what's wrong, just like me, but it's easier to default to like the default of masculinity and manhood, because that's what we've seen be done time and time again. It's what's given people power, or a sense of power, or a sense of authority in their lives. And I think that's why we get a lot of men shifting towards like red pill content, or like whatever values that are degrading for both men and women when they're built on themes of patriarchy. So I think that's why it's an important conversation to have. And I have notes, because if I don't look at my notes, I will get off topic. But the question that I've been having is, how can men, have like a positive sense of masculinity without compromising their identity and self-esteem, but letting go of the toxic natures? Like it's a tough question to ask. I think there's an easy straight answer, but in real life application, it's hard to get to that point. And I think Cameron Kidd's journey in this movie does shine a light to what we could be doing to help in these situations, as Black women, as Black men, whatever. And the first thing that I wanted to note was him, the way he got into this mindset in the first place about needing to sacrifice himself, sacrifice his body. And that in the movie was through, what his father was telling him growing up. And then eventually, once his father passed away, it became the way that he wanted to like fulfill his father's wishes and needs. And a lot of times that's what a lot of people are doing. And like I said, a lot of this stuff is going to apply to men and women, whatever. But like that is how a lot of us are raised to like go after something, to be conditioned by our parents or the people around us to go after a concept of greatness that we may not even conceptualize, but it's ingrained in us from a young age, and it's hard to break out of that. And there's this blog post that I read from 2014 that talked about why men sometimes can become so fixated on legacy, and why that is like what's underlying these themes of patriarchy a lot of the time, because patriarchy is about the passage of legacy, materials, wealth, whatever, from father to son through the male like lineage, whatever. And in this blog, she's saying, what do men really get out of patriarchy if we know that they are suffering as well under this system? And the idea is that they're getting a sense of immortality. They're getting this sense of legacy out of these passages of power and authority, because like at the end of the day, what a lot of people fear is death and don't have a grasp on is death. So being able to hold on to these concepts of immortality is what drives a lot of men to be the way that they are. Like, they want the timelessness, they want their name on buildings, whatever. They want to be known, they want to have money, they want to have like generational wealth. It's because of their discomfort with their own death that men passed on materials and make sure things stay in house when it comes to patriarchy. And she has a great summary about that I will link in my bio. But essentially, why I think that's important to talk about is that I think Black men grow up with a fear of death that is very different from a lot of their counterparts, because we've grown up seeing, we've grown up understanding slavery, we grew up understanding Jim Crow, racism, and how being Black can put a target on your back in some spaces. And so they're growing up with an intense fear of death, intense fear of, what they have to lose, because we see Black people lose a lot in our lifetime. And so when it comes to legacy and immortality and the passage of legacy between, but like to their next generation, to their bloodlines, like I can see how that's so much more important for Black men, because they want to set like their family up, their generations up to come based on like the history of what we've lost. And so that puts some perspective in place for me. And I think that, it's a discussion to be had about, what are we asking Black men to sacrifice? What are we putting in Black men's head that's pushing them towards sacrificing themselves to get to that space where they only feel like driving after this one thing is going to make them feel like they've achieved something in their lifetime. So I think that's a conversation to be had for Black men, but that's my perspective on that. The second thing that I noticed in the movie is this concept of what's it? Oh yes, he was talking about how after his father passed away, the field was his only safe space, and I think that is a conversation that has garnered more traction. That Black men need more safe spaces to be emotional and vulnerable. But I think that's something we really need to start putting into practice and stop just saying, because as soon as a man is like anything outside of stoic or cut off, it becomes sassy or not real men or gay, which is insulting to gay men and emasculates them. And so I think that's a conversation to be had about thinking, where can Black men process their emotions safely in a space that doesn't require them to be putting themselves physically in danger and putting themselves in these spaces of violence. The only place a Black man can go for safety of emotion should not be a toxic locker room or on the field where they are literally like sometimes in life or death situations. Like, that's crazy to me. Like, we should be having conversations about how to like create more safe spaces. The other thing that the movie brought up is, this concept of power and fighting for power. And to me, the ultimate piece of power that he was aspiring to at first was, getting that contract. That contract was going to get him power in the world. It was going to get him fans, get him almost like a worship like sense, get him the career of his dreams. Like, that is the power he was going after. But when we're looking at power, we're talking about authority over something. We're talking about like control, and with that can come violent themes kind of thing. And we saw that in the movie. And I think we should start decentering pursuing power in this country and center empowerment. And that's probably going to sound corny, whatever, but I think for me, power is like a contract. It's a tool to control others, but empowerment is having internal control. It's about autonomy and independence. And I think that's something we should push more for Black men, because to me, we should not be teaching Black men to aspire to excellence that was defined by our oppressors. We should be defining our own terms of what empowerment looks like for our community and go about our day, kind of thing. But yes, that's what I have to say for that point. The next thing that the movie highlights is this concept of Black bodies being used as commodity. And we see that with the free agents who come in just to get their stuff rocked on the field playing with Isaiah White. And we also see that in Isaiah White, near-death experiences, having to do like blood transfusions, all that, putting his body on the line for this job, for this game. And again, that's a theme that applies broadly, where we see, this idea that we are supposed to sacrifice to get to greatness in this country. Like, that's the concept of the American dream. And I think we can pinpoint that and we're able to have discussions around that. But that's another thing where we haven't really truly gotten to a point where we can get ourselves out of that system. And I think the way to get Black men or people in general to stop feeling like they are just commodity is to truly build relationship with them. Because them feeling like they're a commodity starts in the house. It starts when you tell men that they need to sacrifice for their family, they need to work, make money, and that's it. Or they need to be bringing XYZ to the table. That has nothing to do with forming real, genuine relationships with them. And so I think true relationship is what's going to overcome this feeling of commodity, and this feeling that they can be thrown away unless they make themselves worthy or of value, when the topic should be that they are worthy and of value inherently just by being who they are as Black men. And so we should put less pressure on what they are doing to make themselves worth more and put more emphasis on they are already enough kind of thing. And that can be done in a way that does not take away their masculinity or take away what, is, the positive aspects of that. Like, if they want to be a certain way without the violence and the toxicity, I think that can be done. And I think all this change is going to come when we redefine our values, because a lot of what Black men are aspiring to isn't even the peak of masculinity in this country, or what they're given in terms of being defined as a man or not is defined by white men. And because they are marginalized people, because they are Black men in this country, a white man is never going to give them the full status of what a man, quote unquote, is, because they're always seen as subhuman, always seen as commodity in those spaces. And so I think we need to redefine our values of manhood and masculinity in a way that is not defined by our oppressors, which I've said previously. How can we, decide what's good for our communities outside of what's been told will make us good enough? You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? I hope so. And so those are my takeaways that I had from the film as it relates to masculinity and manhood. I think that this is an important conversation to be had because we're seeing violence between men and women in the Black community. We are. And we're also seeing mental health issues. We're seeing people get injured in these sports where they're being told to use up their bodies and to go after this thing, when only a small percentage of people who play between middle school, high school, college, and professional football actually become these greats. And so I say all that to say these are my opinions, perspectives that I've taken away. Like I said, I am a woman, so I can't necessarily have a full perspective on this, but I am looking forward to hearing more about what other men, Black men, have taken away from this film, especially those who have been involved with sports or those who grew up being told they would basically need to sacrifice and grind their whole lives to be worth anything. I think that's a conversation that should be generated, and I will be ready to listen. I do also want to say that I think even in the context of all this, I don't necessarily think something is all wrong with Black men in this country. I know that these conversations and topics I've brought up do not apply to every Black man out there. I'm just being very general with this discussion because it's to serve and highlight specific groups of Black men. I'm not going to sit here and I don't want to paint a picture that everything is wrong with our community, because it's not. But I do think this is a great conversation to have. So thank you so much for watching, and yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your day.